All right, so welcome everyone to another Uplift event. We are excited to have with us today two wonderful women, Tasha, Diaz, and Amanda Freebaron, okay? And pleasure to have you both. I'm gonna turn it over to Amanda. She's gonna be co-hosting this with me to have this discussion with Tasha. And so take it away, Amanda, if you want to introduce yourself briefly, and then you can lead us.
Okay, awesome. My name's Amanda Freebaron. I'm just one of the admins at Uplift. I've been involved with Uplift for about 6 months or so, I guess. And I am really excited to be here and to ask Tasha some great questions about a couple of different topics that she has expertise on. So Tasha, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Tasha. I grew up originally just south of DC and then moved to Texas and then now live in Utah. I got my schooling at BYU and I'm currently a sex therapist.
So we wanted to ask you about a couple of different topics, actually.
Okay.
Let's start with the sex therapy, since you've brought that up. Can you explain exactly to some of our viewers what is a sex therapist exactly, and how does that work within the confines of Mormonism?
Yeah. So fun fact, like our company specifically, so I work with a company called Covenant Sex Therapy. And we specifically cater a little bit to more religious clientele. And since we're in Utah, obviously that's very much LDS clientele. And so with sex therapy, what you're doing is basically if sex is going wrong, you're likely to come into my office. And so that can entail a bunch of things. It can be people who have like impulse control with things like with pornography or just impulsive sexual behaviors that they're frustrated with or that they can't seem to stop. It can include what I would describe as actual porn addictions or sex addictions. Those are the ones most people kind of know somewhere vaguely in the back of their minds. But that's not the bulk of my clients. My clients are largely to do with sexual concerns of some sort. So it could be that they've had sexual trauma and now their sexual relationship, they have anxiety around sex. They could have some medical or clinical issues such as pain in their vulva or vulvodynia, as well as something, colloquial term would be vaginismus, which basically means like a panic attack for your vagina. And so like that's a good amount. And then there's what I just jokingly say, people who just don't know how to have sex right. And so
Okay.
Those are another chunk of my clients. Usually they're younger, but sometimes they've had their problems kind of sink really deep in because they've been doing it in a poor manner for several years. Needless to say, those ones are kind of hard because I'm having to rearrange everything for them and work through a lot of hurts over several years. And so, but they're fun, and I enjoy working with any client. My favorites are my clients who are so oblivious to what's going on. Like my newlyweds, I love working with them. And I've enjoyed doing presentations for wards and such on sexual concerns. And so it's just fun. I love my job.
And what led you into this profession? Why did you decide that this is what you wanted to do?
It was like, I don't know if it was one specific decision. I used to joke, and I don't know if it's partially being a sex therapist or probably largely me and just being an East Coaster, but I used to joke that my interests in life were sex and women. And so I was always interested in women's issues and women's concerns and things. And then I was just very, very frank with sexuality. So I just never, most people kind of grow a sense of like propriety would probably be the best word to describe that, or even just a little nervousness, or, you know, they find nice soft words to describe sexual things, and I just never was like that and found sex very curious and wanted to know all the random facts about it. So it was something that was easy for me to discuss. And then in sexual therapy or sex concerns, oftentimes I'm very much helping women kind of find their voice and kind of get more empowered. So it just kind of merged right on in, and it just fit. And so I started specializing it in my master's by just taking lots of clients that had sexual concerns, and I was just good at it. So I stuck with it.
So you mentioned having kind of a frankness or a comfort with discussing sexuality, and I think that's something that, like, maybe it's kind of a joke or a trope that, like, Mormons aren't, or members of the church aren't good at talking about sex at all.
No.
Anything to do with how you were raised? Like, do you encounter, you know, problems with people being raised in a certain way in terms of being more comfortable with sexuality, or is it like?
Yeah. I feel like I'm weird.
Okay.
I'm a little weird. I mean, my family, so a little bit for my history, like I was raised with a single mom kind of thing for the first 9 years, and she married. And so I have a stepdad as well. And so my mom kind of was like the sort where, I don't know if she was always just slightly late about, you know, maturation or sex talks or whatever else. She'd get to me and was like, no, Mom, we already covered that in class, don't worry about it. And move her on. But the sort that they would make jokes all the time. And so I remember one time, and my mom's side of the family is all boys, me and 6 brothers. And so, like, all my little brothers were in the car, like teenager to like maybe 7 or 8 at that time. And my stepdad works at home. And so she was like, we need to get home so you can wiggle the mouse. And we look at it, like, wiggle the mouse, Mom? What do you mean by wiggle the mouse? And you're like, guys, you know what? I was like, are you sure you help him wiggle that mouse, Mom? And so it wasn't everything that, like, it felt very taboo to talk about at the same time. Like, and then I didn't grow up in Utah. I mean, I lived here 2 years when I was a kid, like a little kid, like 8 or 9. And most of the time I was on the East Coast. And then after the East Coast, I was in Texas. And so I don't know if there was as much cultural, like, discomfort with discussing sex, or I just had weird friends. I don't know what happened to me. I think that's what I'm trying to say. But there is definitely, like, a lot of people have cultural baggage that makes talking about sex really difficult. I've had clients who have to take off their glasses so that they can't see me while they're talking about sex. I've had people who look up at the ceiling, who hesitate to say the word vagina or sex or penis. And I'm telling them, like, come on, just say it. And I'm like, vagina. I was like, I can't hear you. Can you say it a little louder? And so, you know, I think there is definitely a cultural discomfort. And on top of that, you have to be okay making people uncomfortable on a regular basis.
Right.
Which, even if you're okay talking about sex, usually people don't like making other people uncomfortable, especially about sexual things. And so I don't know what happened to me. Something's wrong. It didn't click right.
We have a lot of LDS parents in our group. Do you have like, general advice that you give to parents about how to help their kids avoid some of those, you know, obviously there still needs to be a sense of respect and sacredness when talking about sexuality, but not to the point where you can't even say words to properly discuss sexual functioning?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's usual advice that's given kind of, and so which is along lines of, like, you start by teaching kids proper anatomy terms when they're young, and to not necessarily poo them away from touching themselves, especially when they're little, because it's nothing that big of a deal, you know, and just making it more frank and normal. And I actually would recommend talking young, because around 8 or 9, I have this, like, funny Christmas video pinpointing this exact moment, but after about 8, 9, 10, sex and talking about sex becomes really uncomfortable for little kids. They get embarrassed if you haven't brought this up before. And so, you know, talking about the basics about sexuality a little bit, not in, like, graphic detail, but explaining, like, you know, if your second kid comes, like, so how did you make that baby, kind of thing, and giving some basic explanation. You know, so that by the time you get to 8 or 10, they, like, you can hopefully still manage to give them conversations, especially when you need to, because 8, 9, 10 is when they're starting to be introduced to sexual ideas at school. 10 to 12 is when they're definitely starting to get introduced. I've met a few people who were uber innocent, somehow missed the boat for a long time, and about 14 was when they started talking. But nowadays, like, it's very, very common for kids, for example, to be introduced at 10 to pornography, 10 to 12. And so you need to be able to have communication about sexual topics and to have them feel like they're safe to, like, hey, if you heard something at school, or one of your friends mentioned something that you're not sure what it is, come talk to me. So that they come to you first before they go to Google. And so, you might find out about oral sex a little differently if they find it out from Google.
Right.
And so, so that way it just leads to a more open, easy conversation. I tell people it's not the talk, it's talking, period. You're just talking. And so I think in my mind, sex shouldn't be any different than talking about any other topic, whether it be gospel topic or not. Like, if you want kids to have a firm understanding about something and you want them to be healthy and want them to grow and develop in that, you talk about it. If you don't, they don't. It's not rocket science here.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, you mentioned pornography.
Yes.
I think that's a very important topic of discussion to have as well. A lot of times I think, like you said, kids are getting introduced to pornography very young because of the internet. Yeah. How do you suggest parents, first of all, go about having the discussion to introduce kids to the idea that, they may one day, even without Google searching, stumble across something? And then I guess as a separate question, if they do find out that their kids have been involved in viewing or reading pornography, what is the next step to help their children?
First, take a deep breath and don't freak out. I think a lot of parents, when they first find out, like, they freak out about it, and kids feel really ashamed and horrified. And so, and then if they ever have a problem again, they just hide it. So I recommend first, don't take a breath and don't freak out about it. That's why I also mentioned to start talking early so that you can start to explain early on, hey, some kids, sometimes, sex is really nice and wonderful, but you're getting to an age that kids get curious about bodies, and it's okay to be curious about bodies, but at the same time, some pictures and some things may not be appropriate, and may make you feel uncomfortable. And if you feel uncomfortable at anything, or, because usually, especially when they're so young, like if you're being introduced at around 10, they don't even know how to really process it, would be a better word to describe it. So oftentimes it can almost be kind of traumatic to them when they're first introduced, like, whoa, what is that? If there's something that makes you uncomfortable, or that your friends are sitting there going like, oh, you should like this or something, come talk to me about it. And we can discuss what that made you feel and kind of like, how to avoid that, or what we can do to make this better for you. The big thing is, especially once you get to teenage years, if this comes out and you find out they're looking at porn, is you got to remember, like, I think a lot of parents' first response is to try and get that sucker out of the home as quickly as possible. And so they'll do blocks and things, but it's not really teaching your kids how to be agents to themselves and to take accountability for their own actions, which means you're just delaying the inevitable. Teenage years is when you're trying to teach them how to manage themselves. And so, for example, I had a brother who, which should be surprising considering how many brothers I had, but struggled for a little bit with pornography. And he came to me. Well, I came to him. So, it's a fun story. My mom's like, oh yeah, your brother's just having a couple struggles, and he's a good kid, really good kid. And I was like, oh, it's got to be porn. He's 15. And she's like, I didn't say anything. So it's like, no, don't worry about it. I'll talk to him on Christmas. So after Christmas, we're like, hey, Kay, we got to talk. He's like, oh, no. Like, it's probably only two things. It's my grades or it's the other thing. And it's like, it's the other thing. And so, but like, I didn't sit there and shame him or sit there and go like, yeah, no, what are you doing? What are you thinking? I sat there. It's like, it's normal to be interested in that stuff. because it is, you know, he's a teenager. Like, they have hormones. Generally, it's a normal thing to kind of be interested or find it sexually arousing. And so, you know, I asked him, instead of sitting there going like, you need to do this or that, I was like, hey, okay, so this is, tell me a bit of like where the problem happens. For him, it happened a lot with Instagram. I was like, okay, what should we do, or what would be good to like help that? Like, what could we do? Like, and so I learned a little bit about it and learned that you could uninterest things, because I'm not a social media savvy person. So, and I was like, well, you could do that, and you know, I could like stay on the phone while you do that. And he's like, no, I got it. I was like, okay, you go and take care of it. And I gave him the, you know, like, I wanted to let him know that I had his back and I was on his team. But I let him make the big decisions. And it gave him more sense of control and more capacity to say, I can choose not to do this. And so, and then on top of that, at least for him, especially because when you're feeling, especially if you have a pretty good kid, like for the most part, like he often felt like he was the only one. So I made it really, really clear, like, kid, you're not the only one to struggle. You're probably just the most honest one about it. You know, and so like, just helping him realize that this isn't something that is weird or that he's doing that's abnormal. And if you make them feel abnormal, they bury it and feel worse about themselves. And so the thing for me is to make it feel normal to have a problem with this, or normal to have a concern with this, but also to give them the tools to figure out how to figure it out themselves, you know, and to brainstorm and collaborate with them as to tell them, you will stop doing this, you will stop doing this.
Okay. One term that we use a lot among Latter-day Saints when talking about pornography is we're quick to jump on the addiction word.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, you know, feel like that's overused? Do you feel
yeah. I was like, oh yeah, no, it's super.
How does a parent make that judgment between, okay, this is a real serious problem, we need to go to a therapist, versus like, this is, you know, a 14-year-old, he was an accident, he's got hormones, he's not trying to be, you know, a problem. Yeah.
My usual go-to is to assume when they're teenagers, they don't have an addiction. And the way I think, again, the way I think about this is like, think of yourself at 14. How good were you at impulse control at 14? You know, how much did you rationally decide through your problems before making a decision? You know, like, they're not good at it. You know, and when you find something that is interesting and that makes you kind of like feel things that feel good, but like a little dirty, but feel good, like, it's, you know, you're just a teenager. And so 9 times out of 10, I would just say, these kids are kids, like, and treat them like it's not that they have an addiction, but they may have some sort of struggle, or to see if they're, you know, for even ones that are starting to use excessively, like they're going at it like 3 or 4 times a day or something, and it's starting to affect their grades, or they're, you know, doing things that are worse behavior-wise. So, but they don't usually happen when they're teenagers. It's usually when they're adults. And so that they start to amplify their behaviors. But if you see that a lot, just kind of sit there and go, okay, like, what's going on? Like, how are you feeling about life in general? So I would ignore the porn for a second. And so they're like, how are you feeling about life? And they might be like, well, I'm struggling. Like, I feel really depressed, or like my friends just don't want to hang out with me anymore, or things like that. You'll start to see that there might be other details going on. Usually the difference between what kind of makes like what you might describe more as a porn addict versus just someone who uses porn or even abuses porn a little bit is oftentimes, you know, they're introduced young, sure, but on top of that, they also have some sort of emotional disruption. And it could be that they're struggling with anxiety, depression. It could be that their parents just recently got divorced. And they don't have a means or way to express that, or they don't know how to share that, or they don't have a safe place. And so fostering a safe place and making it more of a normative conversation, and to, you know, just to sit there and be frank with them, but at the same time, not hyper focus on the porn, can go a long way in making sure that you're not going to have a problem later on.
as a professional, like what topics do you feel like maybe a Latter-day Saint audience might need to know a little bit more about in your area of expertise?
You know, we talk a lot about how to talk to kids about it. And then we talk a lot of it about, you know, with books or something about what to do with when you're married, but we miss a really important step, which is like the YSA years, you know, the young adult years. And that's where you're really exploring and learning about your sexuality, learning about how to make a relationship that's sexually congruent. And we don't like talking about that. We like to believe our YSAs are innocent as peaches and pie. And some of them really are. I've met them and I'm like, oh my gosh, kid, how did you miss this? But a lot of them aren't. And, you know, we teach sexuality for 20-something-year-olds the same way we teach it for 15-year-olds. And it's a different ball game at that point. And so, you know, one of the things I mentioned is just kind of, again, and it's still that basis of like you're having an open conversation with them as kids, but, you know, giving them a little bit of allowance to like explore a little bit, and not like crazily, but to teach them like, yeah, you know, if you're feeling congruent in this relationship, you feel like you're emotionally involved and he's emotionally involved, and there's a good connection, you should want to kiss, you know, and instead of making it like be careful, you know, edge away from your sexuality as far as you can because it's dangerous. Sit there and go, yeah, you should want to kiss them. You should want to hold their hand and cuddle. It's natural. It's a good thing. You're wanting that there. And so kind of helping them realize that like your sexuality should be congruent where you are in your relationship and that you are the primary agent to it. I think we give a lot of, without meaning to, it's a cultural thing, but we give a lot of, propriety to the bishop to decide what you should do with your body, which is weird. It's just weird. And I joke, like, so have them pull up a different question from like the temple recommended, right? And I'll be like, okay, let's say you're having you answer the question, are you honest with your fellow man, right? And, you know, most people are like, well, yeah, I am. I was like, and I'm like, oh, look, I was like, really? All the time. Every minute, you're honest. And soon enough, you're like, well, at the mind of the police officer, I did know I was going 40 and 25. I lied to the librarian about where I lived. You know, like, and we'll talk about our little white lies. And I was like, okay, then why don't you tell the bishop about all your lies? And they're like, I was like, well, you know, I mean, why would I think I can handle that. I was like, okay, so why can you handle all of those and decide when you need to talk about that, but you can't do that for sex and your sexuality? Why are you needing to go to another person to decide what's right or wrong for you? And so I think that's like, and culturally, you know, and then if you told the person, I white lied to my friend about her looking good in a dress, the bishop's not going to go, oh, so do you have other lying concerns, problems? No one ever does that. But when you talk about this with sex, like, oh, so what other problems you got going on? Are you sure that's it that's going on sexually? You know, we take the weight of sexual sins somehow heavier than any other sin on that question. And that's not true. And so I recommend, and this is, you know, from the book of Tasha, but like I recommend really strongly having it be more in balance, where you're really being honest with like, hey, again, how can we help you be an agent of yourself? How can you learn to develop a relationship with God so that you can decide when you've crossed the line in a relationship? How can you teach chastity in a sense of it's, you know, you're practicing to see if you can have a good relationship with somebody. And that should be congruent with the covenants you've made and how close you are in a relationship. So don't nickmo on the first date. You don't know this person. You know you're not going to know that person really well. Yeah, that would be my rule in my head. But sit there and go like, okay, what would be what feels congruent in your relationship at that time so that your sexuality is matching up with your relationship and your sense of spirituality. And so that's my go-to. It's a very different take than I think a lot of times we see in wards, and especially YSAs. I should know I was a YSA for like 12 years. So but I think that's kind of the direction we need to take a little bit more, is again re-emphasizing the agency and the relationship that you build with God to understand what you need to do in your life.
Okay, great, wonderful. So I've had one more question on my list that I skipped over that you had sent me before, and it says, we kind of touched on it, but how does Mormon culture interrelate with sexual dysfunction?
It does. I would say to go really quickly on this one, like it's less than some people think, but oftentimes more too. And I know that's really vague, but I have a lot of people that come into my office and they'll sit there and it's like, yeah, I'm struggling to have a sexual desire, and things like that. And I was like, oh, why? It's like, well, when I was raised Mormon, we learned it was taboo and stuff. And then I was like, okay, and then tell me about your family. And I'm here in this family culture that really shamed sex. And I've heard enough Mormon families to know that not all Mormon families interact with sex the same way.
Right.
And so we take out all these other behaviors, or like I was sexually assaulted when I was younger. I was like, okay, I think that might have had an effect too. And so recognizing that Mormon culture does have an effect, and it often has, again, a culture of kind of being tepid and nervous about discussing sex, about being okay interacting with sex. We definitely gender sexuality, so it's more often for my young men to have a sense that they do have sexuality. They just got to control it, probably get married, and then it's, woo, we're good to go. And like the young women, on the other hand, are usually kind of assumed to not have a sexual desire. They're taught law of chastity, almost in a sense of like, you got to make sure that you control this. You got to make sure that this is okay. For the guys, we know you're wonderful, innocent angels from God, and which is ridiculous. I was a horny teenager. I know that it was ridiculous, and so we do gender, and it does lead to a sexual repression, especially for women. But there's other influences that are just as poignant, such as the culture that has increased influence of pornography at a young age. What they're hearing from their peers, whether they played sports. Honestly, there's often sports cultures around sexuality. There's all these other influences that also play. And so if you feel like religion has had an effect on it, it probably has, but also recognize you might have other influences too that are equally as important, that you'll need to think about.
Leo, do you have any questions that you wanted to add, or anything you wanted to jump in with before we move on topics?
Well, I wanted to give, if it's okay, if I can give Anthony a minute here to ask a question or two about the topic.
Yeah.
He's my good friend. I don't know if you've interacted with him at all yet, but Anthony, do you want to take yourself off mute, or I can unmute you and go ahead?
Sure. How's it going?
Good.
Yeah. No, I've just kind of jumped in here. I didn't even actually realize until I kind of looked at the description that you're a sex therapist. So I was just like, oh, cool, fun topic. But anyways, yeah, I really like what you're kind of saying at the end there. One thing I was thinking about when it comes to like you said, like addiction, and how, very much in the church, and I think it's well-meaning, we operate on the kind of assumption by some clinicians, whatever, that pornography is a behavioral addiction, all these different things. And I do find that really interferes with the sense of agency. And agency is a doctrine that we stress so much in the church and in the gospel. But it seems like when it comes to things like sex and pornography, it's like suddenly, I don't want to say it's almost out of the window, but it's almost treated like that. And that always kind of bugged me, that we suddenly think, oh, well, now you just look once and you're hooked. It's like a drug, da, 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 da. And so, you were kind of talking about it a little bit. I guess my first question would be, how do you help people to kind of regain that sense of like, hey, you like have agency in these decisions, like you do choose whether or not you're going to do this, which might lead to this, might lead to this.
Yeah.
Versus, oh, well, you know, if you've looked, then you're basically doom and gloom, and you're going to have to do all these things just to overcome, you know, and you'll always have it. That's the other thing, like, oh yeah, once an addict, always an addict, which is totally a lie and against
Yeah.
the atonement. But I just, yeah, curious what your thoughts are about helping people to regain that sense of agency.
And it very, very much depends. So one of my first things I do is to gauge whether they actually have a sexual addiction. And so oftentimes I've had this happen before where I'll have a client that comes in and I'll sit there and go over like some of the things like, how often do you actually look? What are you looking at? What are your behaviors around this? Like, what are you feeling emotionally before and after kind of thing? And these questions start to weed out whether I really have a sex addict, you know, and all these little pieces that come together, and I'll look at them and it's like, sweetheart, I'm sorry, you don't have an addiction. And they'll be like, wait, what? And I was like, yeah, you don't have an addiction. You have a problem. And you're using this to emotionally kind of like take care of yourself in an unhealthy way. And we probably need to find you some better emotional tools to heal. But you don't have an addiction. And they'll be like, but I've gone to therapy about this. I've gone to groups. I talked to my bishop. And I was like, yeah, well, sorry. You know, and that's one of my first ones, is to help them decide if they actually have an addiction. And realizing that they don't in and of itself makes them realize, oh, if I don't have an addiction, then I might have control over this. And like I mentioned, realizing like, yeah, you're using this kind of to like numb out your pain. How about we manage your pain?
Yeah.
And then that adds that level of agency of like, okay, now you can be an agent to help you realize how to work with your pain better. And here are the tools that you can use to work with pain better. Or to, you know, you're feeling really isolated. Okay, let's work on your social skills and finding times to go and try to be with friends, you know, and to work on those little behaviors. And when I realize it's not an addiction, I actually defocus on pornography and refocus on the concerns that are actually bolstering that pornography app.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah, I think it's interesting because, yeah, when we focus on addiction, it's like we focus just on the behavior to the exclusion of all else. The behavior is a problem, not what's actually causing this behavior in the first place and what's trying to supplant. So I love that. Thanks for sharing. Mm-hmm. Another thing I just wanted to ask you about is if you have any recommendations as far as like, you know, like books or kind of faithful perspectives that can still help people to kind of get this. Like, for instance, I heard about this book at Deseret Book. I just saw it and I was like, wow, first of all, awesome title. Like, we need this.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar. I've like kind of went through it and I've heard it's actually going on a pretty good trend towards like being more open, less like, you know, chew bubble gum object lesson, much more talk to your kids at different stages of life. So what's kind of your take on, you know, how we can kind of get that to a more, you know, typically looking at it one way Mormon, you know, kind of group? And what kind of books or what kind of things can they do, maybe?
So, I mean, I work usually with couples, and my boss came out with a really good book, and he's also a sex therapist. And so his book is You, Me, and We, I'm pretty sure. It's also at Deseret Book, but his name's Anthony Hughes. And so he talks more about sexual relationships in marriage, obviously.
Right.
I'm trying to think. I should have more, like, but on the spot, I can't think of ones where, like,
it's
pornography. I know that there's better ones that are coming up. But I don't think they've launched yet. But it's starting to change. So, like, for example, the church is working on a website, kind of like they just did with abuse.lds.org, pornography. And I liked it because it didn't just say pornography addiction. They talked about pornography use, period. And talking about some of the more emotional stuff. And so I think even the church, Dallin Shows talk a while ago, I think it showed up in the Ensign.
The Trap of Pornography, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and it talked more about like that there were 4 different types of levels as opposed to just porn addiction or no use.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of those are helping to kind of mitigate this culture that it's one way only, and if you have this problem, you're really in trouble.
Right. And if you say, oh, I don't label myself as an addict, you're not just deluded or whatever, because I think people can push back and they're like, well, you're addicted because you're just denying it. And it's like, well, what's the circular logic you're using? But no, I'm really glad to see that there's books like that, you know, that are really trying to push that in a different way. Because, I think there are so many of the youth, like, you know, they're like some great people, but they're just so caught up on this one thing in their life and they just think it's like, oh man, I'm just this horrible person. and it just leads downward. And, you know, I went through that too, you know, even joining at 16, because I was, you know, a young convert. I also, you know, experienced same-sex attraction, so that kind of threw things, you know, in for a wrench too. And so it's always been on my, you know, kind of mind, you know, throughout my journey of faith. And so I'm just glad we're actually talking about it now.
Yeah, I think just that we're talking about it is making it a little bit better. And I've liked what the church has been doing. They've had a couple of videos for how to like talk to your kids about sex and stuff that are found on their, like, the YouTube sites. And with just like better discussion, and they're actually therapists that are talking about it like, as well. They introduce or have therapists come on who have expertise in this area. So we're really working. I think it's slowly shifting. I'm not saying it's this drastic change. We're slowly shifting in a way that's more positive and recognizing that there's variations.
Right. Yeah.
We're getting there.
I remember Susan was in the Deseret News even about a sex therapist who, you know, talked about that. I can't remember her name. I think she's out of Salt Lake. But
yeah.
It's really interesting.
Thanks for your questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Anthony. That was great. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes left or so. If we have other people that want to come off mute and ask a question or just type it in the chat, please go ahead as a reminder. That's fine to do either way. I thought maybe we could just quickly shift gears because I'm also very interested in how it is for you, Tasha, to live in Utah and in Happy Valley, person of color. And I thought maybe you could just talk us through as much as you can advice for anybody that watches this that lives in a densely homogenous type of environment, culture where, you know, there's not a lot of diversity. What could you share with us, or any advice you have for people?
Well, first, let me give a little bit of background on, like, racial background, ethnic background. So I come from a pretty, well, my immediate family is extremely diverse, I should say that. So my mom is like pioneer stock, white lady, Idaho, Oregon area. And then my bio dad is Nigerian. My stepdad is Mexican American. My husband's Peruvian. My brother is half Navajo. What am I missing? My other brother's half Moroccan. Yeah. And so I think that's about the larger groups that I have. So I've been used to having a lot of diverse areas. And then I grew up just south of DC when I was a kid, and realized, like, I look back at the pictures, I didn't think about it at the time, and realized, oh, I was just always used to kind of more of a diverse bubble. That was most of my friends for most of my childhood. And so for people who are like coming to Utah from having diverse, I remember one of the first things that happened is just culture shock. And it's kind of like almost like a color shock. I remember we were driving through, I think it was Moab, somewhere in the South. And, you know, I had just been from Texas, where all the construction workers were Latino and like men usually and older. And I was looking on the side of the road, and there were these two smiling children with like bright white teeth in the construction gear. And I was like, is this a Target ad? Because it looked so weird. And a lot of things, like just the first few minutes at Utah where I'm looking, and there's like this 20-something-year-old, she couldn't look older than me, and she had like 2 kids already. And I'm like, what's going on? It was just a huge shock to kind of come here. And my family is part white. Like a good chunk of it is white. And for people who aren't, like, have immediate family that are white or have been in white majority areas before, it's a huge shock. You know, and it takes, like, allow yourself some time to get used to it. It comes with its specials. There's things that, especially here, because you're like, you can be a minority in a different place with lots of other minorities, and it doesn't feel as strange. But when you're here, you're not just a minority, you're a numerical minority. Like, you are a severe numerical minority. And so, like, it's one of the things that helped me and a lot of my friends were finding little enclaves of racial diversity. So a number of my friends did BSU, which is Black Student Union at BYU. I did a dance group for a long time. ROC, which was a multicultural dance group. So it had Latinos, Polynesians, Native Americans, Black, African, Caribbean, African American, Asian groups that we danced for, and we like shared in the culture. It was just very, very comfortable for me. Like, I'm more comfortable in a diverse setting than I am in a homogenous one. No matter what the homogenous setting is, I feel best when it's a mix of people, because that's what I grew up with. And so, like, finding their little enclaves, I went to varying specialty wards, whether it was just to visit or just to actually be a part of it. I currently go to the Spanish ward with my husband. And all of those kind of just give this moment of solace and relief. And it's a very weird way to describe it, but you know, when I like Utah, I really do. I wouldn't be living here if I didn't like it. I like hiking. I have a lot of family here. It's a good place. But especially when I was at school, oftentimes what would happen is, you know, especially if I was in different racial settings or something, like, A, you're going to run into some ignorance, and B, like, even when they were learning, you were the teacher all the time, which is a little exhausting sometimes. And sometimes you just want to have a moment where you can talk and lay out your hair and people get it. And so, like, having that comfort to, like, just have a group of people that get it, and you don't have to explain or soft pedal it, it's kind of really nice in homogenous zones. Obviously, that can't happen all the time. You know, there's places where you might be. I remember I went to Thanksgiving once with a friend, and it was out in the middle of nowhere, Utah. And I don't remember what city or town. It was a small town, cute as heck. And I remember walking through the grocery store, and minus me, the only thing that even came close to a minority was a brunette. And I was like, oh my gosh, where am I? Like, it was so white. And, you know, if I lived there, I would probably be literally the only minority in that town. You know, there's areas that are very, very, very minority deficient per se. So obviously that might not be the case all the time. But like, I think as minorities, especially if you haven't lived in Utah, you kind of naturally get that in the end. Like, but that's what kept me sane in school, was just having my own group of friends and places that I could go that I could just feel myself.
So we took a trip when I was little out east and drove back, doing some church history, type of stuff. And I remember stopping in a McDonald's. I think it was some part of New York that was mostly Black.
Yeah.
And I remember my parents seemed nervous. I mean, I love my parents, but they just seemed nervous. They seemed like it was, you know, we need to hurry.
Yeah.
You know? And I remember going in there feeling like, because I was young enough, I felt like, well, this is a cool experience. I felt like this is cool.
Yeah.
I like being
all
here.
These different people, and
because I grew up in Bountiful in Utah.
Oh, yeah.
And so in downtown Salt Lake, and so the diversity I was exposed to really just was not there. And so
yeah.
I remember that moment just is like it's one of those few memories that I have that you know, and they were fine. My parents were like are not racist, but they were just like, this is not normal for us, and so we're kind of out of our element. So I have a taste of that.
Yeah.
Just a taste of it, just
yeah.
briefly. And so I definitely feel that sympathy. And I was watching a video to tie this in the other day. I was watching a video of it was a discussion panel. I don't know the exact details, but Wayne Myers, you know, from the Genesis group. Have you met him?
Oh yeah. Okay.
So Wayne was on this discussion panel, and at the end, a Q&A, this white brother stood up and said, hey, we've been commanded to be one as a people. And he's like, what's the need for this Genesis group? Why do you have to, you know, separate yourselves out? And Wayne let him have it. You know,
good for Wayne.
I'm glad he did, because we've got to learn that as a majority of white saints, we've got to be able to extend ourselves and go in. And my thought was going to say to this guy, if I could have a chance, to say, have you been to Genesis group? Have you gone? Have you participated? Have you put yourself into their mix and talked to them and loved them? Or are you just judging them? You know?
You know, and so people like, well,
go ahead.
I was like, for people who've like, because that's a common thing that happens with specialty wards, especially where they're sitting there like, why can't they be integrated in? Like, let them be just part of the ward, you know, and just be one. We have to learn together, yada yadas. And which, you know, they're looking at that like probably, and I can see it scripturally, where, you know, in 3rd Nephi, where they talk about that end where it's like, and there's no other ites, you know, and racial and ethnic groups are ites in a sense, but they don't look at the other process that it took. And specialty groups to me are like the anti-Nephi Lehites when they joined the Nephites. They didn't go and disperse amongst the Nephites. They had this little area that they congregated in, and they had their peoples. And they became a refuge for people that didn't fit the Lamanites or the Nephites very well anymore. You know, when the king, when they had that big issue and the two people were, what's the word I'm looking for, were framed for murder, basically, they ran to the anti-Nephi Lehites. They went to the people of Ammon for safety. And, you know, when you're wanting to become one, you know, oftentimes we haven't fully realized that, like, we still hold a lot of culture in this church. We hold a lot of cultural baggage. And we kind of recognize that sometimes, you know, there's a lot of people, like, I think I saw a discussion earlier about black and white thinking, and, you know, and, or perfectionism or things like that, don't get me wrong, it can be a church cultural thing, but it's oftentimes honestly more white. You know, someone asked, like, how can you be, like, you know, because I was like, I don't really know if I had this urge to, like, be perfect. And I was like, how'd you miss that boat? It's like, I don't think I had the chance to be in the boat. You can't be in the boat, you're not going to try, you know. And, like, you know, I had a single mom who, like, I wasn't born in the covenant. That whole families can be together forever song did not apply to me all of my childhood. So how in the world was I ever going to be in this perfect ideal family boat? I can't. I got to make it my own way. And so, like, I think with specialty wards, they act as the agents to help be one, and to be able to take your identity and your culture and your person and be able to have that be okay in a worshipful sense. So, like, for example, in Genesis, like, you're going to have a gospel choir when you get there. And it's a nice gospel choir. They sing beautifully. I need to go, like, at some point real soon. You know, when you go to a Spanish ward, they're speaking Spanish. And they're, like, you know, our ward here, our stake president came to our ward recently, and they mentioned, like, you know, we make 15% of the ward, but we make 80% of the baptisms. And, you know, the convert baptisms here. And so there are places that often, especially in Utah, when I've gone to specialty wards, are places that you feel safe to be different. And it's okay. And it's not just okay, it's wanted. Your difference is, you're here. And so I remember at Genesis one time, a person who was obviously drunk, smelled of alcohol, sat down in the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, people came up, talked to him, chatted with him, asked how he's doing. You know, you were home because you were there. and that, you know, that can happen in, like, the regular wards in Utah. You know, I've heard of it and seen it happen, but it's just more capable to reach out to different groups and cultural experiences and have those be accepted and have those be understood, and then help them bring to Christ. And that's how we stay be one and can be one, even though we go to different wards.
Yeah. So that's really well said. And what I've noticed is, as someone who is a privileged person, I am privileged in so many ways. It's my job to reach out and to get involved and to go and to rub shoulders. And I should never be the one to say, hey, you need to be one with me.
Yeah. And I'm worried without realizing it, like, they don't realize it, but that's kind of what they're expecting. And, you know, when they're saying, yeah, we should be one, it's with me. It's like as in like what I expect from a core
Yeah.
like experience. And it doesn't necessarily fit, and it can be inadvertently a stumbling block to people who are coming to the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. So yeah, I just want to say you're awesome for living there and to be that new, you know, that number. I think it's incredible, your patience, your love for those people, that because I'm from that area, and I think it's tremendous that you like the mountains, but thank you for being part of the culture there, and just say that. So
I don't know, like I feel almost kind of like guilty a little here, because I don't know if I've fully had to be ingrained into Utah culture yet. And I've lived here for 12 years. Like,
that's okay.
I went to BYU, which still had a lot of people that work from Utah. And I had my dance group, and I went to a singles ward that wasn't a specialty ward for a long time too. But honestly, I've found my little enclaves to feel secure and safe, which is why it's not as hard when I have moments like in my office, because most of my clients are going to be white, you know, because it's the demographics. You know, having little moments that take you off guard and you have to put your tight smile on. One person walked in very confidently, was like, yeah, I was listening to your people's music. And I was like, my people's music? What music was that? Just weird moments where and then these little weird moments that like usually in Utah you don't get the full-blown experience of racism, you get ignorant racism. So I had this one little lady come up and being mixed, she'll be like, oh, are you mixed? Like, yeah. It's like, that must have been really hard. I was like, no, it wasn't. I liked it. You know,
Bless her heart.
I know, bless her soul, but you know, and just little things like that, or like even positive things where again being mixed, and like we're really early but expecting our first, and I'll tell people this, yeah, I'm excited.
Congratulations.
And the first thing they think is like, man, those are going to be some gorgeous children, and I was like, maybe they could be ugly. The opportunity to be ugly.
They always look a little ugly when they first come out, so
they kind of look like twins. And so, and, you know, so like it's little things like that I get to see more often, where it's like, okay, this is a little weird, or people's like fanaticism for my hair, or just a little too exotified, where you're like, okay, that's nice, I'm just gonna go and keep buying groceries now. But like, you know, again, if you have your place that you can go to just feel again normal, like you're just part of a crowd again, that's strangely one of the nicest feelings ever.
Mm-hmm.
And so the closest for white people who are trying to understand that, it's kind of like if they've ever traveled anywhere that was predominantly not their race, whatever race it was, whatever culture it was. I think of like going to Taiwan. I love Taiwan. It was really fun. And then China, but I'd spent 2 weeks out of my country, and when I got home, I wanted the most American tasting food that I could think of. I went for mac and cheese. I got me some like vegetarians. I went for vegetarian buffalo wings. It was like American crap. You know, and it's similar for that, but all the time, where like even though you are, you know, this is your home, this is where you've grown up, like to feel kind of still somehow a little alien in a place that you know is exhausting after a while. And so you just need a place that you can have a moment of refuge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all well said. So we're at the top of the hour. Is there any other final questions anybody wants to bring up in the chat or in person? You can live before we sign off. I know that Tasha, you have a lot of stuff to get done today. I'm sure we've got stuff to do here too. We got 2 kids, so we got to get on.
Let's be honest, I might be tiny, but I love food. So.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, we'll stay in touch, and if people have follow-up questions, comments, please go ahead and post them in the group, and And thanks again, Tasha. Thanks, Amanda, for co-hosting this with me. That was fun.
My pleasure.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.